"You've activated my trap card," one of the most iconic phrases in Yu-Gi-Oh! Till this day. Unfortunately, outside of popular trap cards like Infinite Impermanence, that phrase doesn't get used too much. But that doesn't mean that trap cards were never dangerous and still can't be. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the top 10 most dangerous trap cards that no one plays anymore. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Now, despite trap cards not being used much in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, this was an incredibly hard list to make. And that's simply because, in comparison, trap cards were just about everything in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s past. Something almost like a lost art, and some of these trap cards can actually still be really good till this day. I created a criteria. One is that every single one of these trap cards had a huge impact in Yu-Gi-Oh! Whether it was being really good over the span of multiple formats or completely changing how we approach the game, every single one of these trap cards were good in some way. And two, every single one of these trap cards are still usable in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Play. We could talk about amazing trap cards like Royal Oppression and Trap Does Shoot, but unfortunately, those cards are banned for a reason. And then there's also some really powerful honorable mentions that were really popular along the playground, cards like Fairy Box, which had a huge psychological effect anytime you wanted to declare attack, and even Witch's Strike, one of the most popular trap cards in recent memory. Those, alongside of some other really powerful trap cards, didn't make the list, but definitely go to the honorable mentions. When crafting this list, I genuinely thought of game-changing Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. Some of these cards were so powerful, they actually had to have their effects completely changed. One of those cards being Ring of Destruction. Ring of Destruction is one of the earliest, most powerful trap cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history, and it has a pretty devastating effect. Its original effect read, by destroying a monster on either player's side of the field, both players would take damage equal to that monster's attack. Kaiba's favorite card was so strong at one point in time in Yu-Gi-Oh! It had to be limited. And the biggest reason was because not only could it knock out the best monster on the field, it could also ensure that you would win the game at any point in time. For example, if you just so happen to have more than 3,000 life points and your opponent just so happened to have less than 3,000 life points, summoning a monster like Blackluster Soldier to your side of the field, no matter its impact, would always mean that your opponent would lose the game because of this card. And similar to how Kaiba used to use Ring of Destruction alongside of Ring of Defense, players actually use Ring of Destruction alongside of Barrel Behind the Door, which allowed you to be able to inflict more damage to your opponent. This made Ring a really formidable card, but then players figured out how to take it a step further. Ring of Destruction would ensure that you could never lose a game because how this card was worded. If we go back and modify that original example that I was talking about, let's say both players have under 3,000 life points and a monster like Blackluster Soldier was summoned and the opponent was trying to use it to win the game. Well, Ring of Destruction can be used to ensure that you never lost a game. That right there is what made the essence of Ring of Destruction truly diabolical. So diabolical that it was eventually banned and then errated, saying that it can only be used during your opponent's turn. It can only target a monster your opponent controls whose attack is less than or equal to their life points, and then you would take the damage first, your opponent takes the damage second, meaning that you could never tie a game with this card again. To be honest with you guys, Ring of Destruction's errata is probably one of the very few times that Konami needed to change a card effect. It was one of the most ridiculous cards to ever exist in the game, and ironically, not Kaiba's only card that was too strong and had to have its text changed. And that card does make the list because Crush Card Virus was one of the most ridiculous cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history. Now, Crush Card isn't as powerful as it was on the anime. It didn't tribute Savi the Dark Clown to infect your opponent's entire deck, but it got ridiculously close. By tributing a monster on the field with 1,000 or less attack, you can destroy all monsters on your opponent's field and hand with 1,500 or more attack. But just like some of the older Virus cards, for the next 3 turns, anytime your opponent drew a monster with over 1,500 attack, that card would be destroyed. Crush Card Virus rivaled the powerful Deck Devastation Virus and Eradicator Epidemic Virus with the exact same effects. The card was completely meta warping, especially when you can tribute monsters like Sengan and gain the effect to search another low-level monster from your deck to your hand. This card was originally a prize card that cost over $1,000, and even when it received its reprint, it was $300 for a gold rare. Now, the errata to Crush Card Virus 100% brings it in line and makes it a not so great card. But when we're talking about the other virus cards in Eradicator Epidemic Virus and Deck Devastation Virus, those cards are still insane. Getting rid of your opponent's spells and traps permanently for 3 turns or any monster that they draw under 1500 or less attack is crazy. And its little brother Full Force Virus, while never genuinely competitive, is still a really powerful card that could be used in modern Yu-Gi-Oh to this day. You see, a lot of modern Yu-Gi-Oh monsters are very strong in attack but have a really weak defense, and most hand traps in the game have under 1500 or less attack. These cards in the correct Yu-Gi-Oh strategy could be absolutely devastating, but more importantly, your opponent will never see it coming. Just like how players won't be seeing some of the most dangerous counter traps to ever exist in the game. I think counter traps still to this day are some of the best designed cards in Yu-Gi-Oh, and more importantly, are still some of the more slept on cards in the game. Keep in mind, the only way to respond with a counter trap card is another counter trap card. So more often than not, when you activate these effects, they're going through. It's a pretty big reason why Solemn Strike is still one of the most feared and dangerous Yu-Gi-Oh cards till this day. At the cost of a measly 1500 life points, not only could it stop any monster effect no matter where it activated, it also got to destroy monsters that were special summoned. In today's Yu-Gi-Oh, Solemn Strike can be used to stop powerful applications like when your opponent links, exceeds, or special summons a monster that does not activate an effect. But it also can be used to stop your opponent's hand traps and monsters on the field that are being used to stop your monster effects. And it's almost a crime that Solemn Strike is on this list because it was one of the most dominant, most played trap cards in the game. The same applications that it could be used for today was used back when it came out in Breakers of Shadow. But it really wouldn't be fair to talk about Solemn Strike without mentioning another forgotten counter trap card in Solemn Warning. Solemn Warning works a little bit more differently. At the cost of 2000 life points, Solemn Warning can actually stop the effect of a card to special summon. I want you to think if your opponent is using a card like Monster Reborn or Polymerization. Solemn Strike can't stop the summon of those monsters or the spell card being used, but Solemn Warning can stop the effect of those spell cards to be able to special summon monsters. But Solemn Warning goes a little bit further than Solemn Strike when it comes to stopping summonable monsters. It also can stop normal summons, flip summons, or special summons. Not only does it have the versatility to be able to stop your opponent's first monster that's being brought to the side of the field, it also can stop those same extra deck monsters that are being brought to the field as well. These two cards, when they arrived in the Yu-Gi-Oh space, were some of the most powerful cards to ever exist. Being able to stop your opponent's most important monsters was huge in Yu-Gi-Oh and still can be pretty impactful till this day. Ironically, Solemn Judgment doesn't get in this discussion because it's still being used somewhat, and it was Bandit Keith's card. So we've already covered some of the most popular cards that were used in the anime, or have we? If you guys thought that only Bandit Keith and Kaiba had some powerful anime cards, Yugi has one of the most iconic. Mirror Force was an absolutely devastating card. There was actually a point in time where this card had to be banned. Being able to not only negate the attacking monster but destroy all of your opponent's monsters in attack position could be game-changing. And boy, Konami didn't just stop there. Konami even made more Mirror Force cards for specific archetypes, but some of these Mirror Force cards could be still really good today. And specifically, Storming Mirror Force, Quaking Mirror Force, and Drowning Mirror Force all have some pretty good properties. Battle Trap cards are going to be some of the cards that your opponent expects the least. And it's mainly because Yu-Gi-Oh is way too modernized for players to even consider them. Now, this is not an announcement telling you to splash Mirror Forces in every single one of your decks, but I'm just giving you the heads up that your opponent is not respecting these cards or expecting these cards to be flipped. And while we're speaking of battle traps, Yugi's Magic Cylinders was also a really powerful card at the time that no one will still see coming. Being able to negate an attack is okay, but inflicting damage equal to that monster's attack can be game ending. At this point in time, it's almost a meme to finish your opponent off with Magic Cylinders. It's one of the crazier ways to win. And let's not forget about some of the other more powerful battle cards in Dimensional Prison and Sakuretsu Armor. These cards were a terror to deal with, especially if you play in some of the older formats. Sakuretsu Armor acted as a mini Mirror Force, and Dimensional Prison was really good at getting rid of monsters like Stardust Dragon. These two cards at their height were feared and respected Yu-Gi-Oh cards that players had to take into account for whether they're building their deck or playing the game. Now, if I'm keeping it 100 with you, all of these cards that I mentioned before have a low probability of being played in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It's not necessarily that these cards are bad in any way, shape, or form. It's just the fact that these cards are a little slow. Trap cards' drawback is that they need your opponent to be able to specifically do a card in order to respond. but Icarus Attack is one of the very few trap cards that's technically still being played to this day, and more importantly was one of the most devastating trap cards in the game. Icarus Attack was most powerful in decks like Blackwing during the Edison era, allowing you to be able to destroy multiple cards. If your opponent were to use a card like Mirror Force or Dimensional Prison, you can then further punish them by tributing off the monster that was designated to be destroyed to get rid of more cards on their field. And the reason why I say that it's technically being used to this day is because while Icarus Attack may not be used in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, there are trap cards that work very similar that are being used. Take for example Sword Soul Blackout and Virtue Stream. These two cards are pretty much the spitting image of Icarus Attack, requiring you to get rid of one of your monsters to get rid of two of your opponent's cards. It actually goes back to the really powerful trap card Two-Pronged Attack, a card that was actually good in the early eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! Seriously, Two-Pronged Attack was actually good. See, while Two-Pronged Attack is a prototype version of Icarus Attack and the cards that come after it, it still follows a similar purpose, destroying multiple cards on the field, as well as giving you the utility to use these trap cards at any given time, but focusing more on the multiple destruction that was huge in Yu-Gi-Oh! Still is to this day, and was even bigger of a problem back in the day. It was so big of a problem, Konami had to make a trap card to help counter this massive destruction, and that's where Starlight Road sits on this particular list. Starlight Road is one of the most goated tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards to ever exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it's not a normal trap card. It actually changed what we thought about trap cards and how we approached how to destroy cards. Because if we wanted to destroy multiple cards on the side of the field, we had to consider having that effect negated and having a Stardust Dragon summoned to the side of the field. Starlight Road was a major player during its time, and it can easily shift the momentum of a game. Having protection from not one but two potential destructive cards through Stardust Dragon and Starlight Road was a crazy combination, and is easily considered one of Yusei's best contributions to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Unfortunately, it doesn't stop massive disruption from happening in the game, and it didn't stop the trap hole cards from being some of the most devastating traps. Now, many of you guys may know about Bottomless Trap Hole if you played in Edison formats and formats before, being able to not only destroy a monster over 1500 life points, but permanently remove it from the game because there weren't many options to be able to bring those cards back. Trap Hole was also a really powerful trap card during the game's inception because it could get rid of a monster that was over 1000 attack. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll start to notice that Trap Hole cards are a little bit more than just those two. Acid Trap Hole was used at a point in time to be able to force and get rid of flip effect monsters, and Treacherous Trap Hole was a really powerful card inside of decks that did not use trap cards. The Trap Hole cards have a rich history of being able to get rid of monsters when they're summoned, but they all fell into comparison when it comes to Mako's most powerful card, Torrential Tribute. Making his debut in Labyrinth of Nightmare, Torrential Tribute was a crazy card. Anytime a monster was summoned, it destroyed all monsters on the field, making it a dark hole, but during either player's turn. Torrential Tribute could be used offensively or defensively, getting rid of monsters that you want into the graveyard because of their effects, or getting rid of your opponent's monstrous board. It's one of those trap cards that can be used in present day Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially if you're trying to stop your opponent from building a crazy board. Mako's card Torrential Tribute was so powerful at one point in time that it had to be limited, what actually makes me think about other anime Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that players use that had to be on the ban list, and easily the last one that comes to mind is Call of the Haunted. Call of the Hunted is different than every single one of these trap cards that I've mentioned before. Instead of getting rid of or protecting cards, Call of the Hunted simply brings a monster back to the side of the field. What's so problematic about that? Well, seeing that Call of the Hunted is a continuous trap card, it could easily be recycled with cards like Bryonic Dragon of Ice Barrier before its errata, or other cards like Giant Trunade. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, it would be a little bit too slow, but back in the past, using Call of the Hunted to be able to bring out Jinzo was the biggest craze in the game. Not only could you bring out a powerful monster to negate all trap cards, because you negated your own Call of the Hunted, you would no longer have to send Jinzo to the graveyard if you got rid of it. It was simply one of the most beautiful things about Call of the Hunted, and it actually did find its way on the ban list because of how abusable it was. Call of the Hunted was one of the most secretly powerful trap cards in the entire game. But in order to make this list, I had to step over so many others. There are still some really good trap cards that could be used in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Like Ice Dragon's Prison, some old school cards that did have an impact and made its way to the ban list like Wall of Revealing Light. Cards like Gravity Bind, Royal Decree, Phoenix Wing Blast, all of these cards have had an impact on the game, and I think they're all good honorable mentions. So if you think that I forgot a trap card, go ahead and let me know down below in the comment section, as well as why you think that trap card is so good. I've already technically given you over 10, but the last dangerous trap card that I'm going to be putting on this list is Reckless Greed. It says draw 2 cards. Still to this day, people don't understand what Pot of Greed does, and even less what Reckless Greed does. It doesn't matter about its drawback or its restrictions. It still says draw 2 cards. Of course, big dog, if you like these type of videos, then make sure that you check out the other ones that I have. It was really fun to do another one of these top 10s. I'm also open to any suggestions that you guys have. Just let me know down below in the comment section as well. Until then, check out these videos so I can catch you on the next one.